It's 1912, Bloemfontein, South Africa. In a small church, African chiefs, clergymen, lawyers, teachers, journalists, students, and political leaders are gathering. They have come from different parts of South Africa. And why are they here? Well, the old methods of resistance against colonial invasion have all failed. Across Africa, the old rulers had raised armies. Communities had mobilized. Warriors had marched against the colonial invasion. But one resistance after another had all been crushed. African leaders had been killed, captured, or exiled. Kingdoms had fallen, and colonial rule had taken hold across the entire continent. African land was being placed under white control. African authority was fast disappearing, and new colonial systems were pushing Africans far away from the governance of their own land. Now, inside this small church, these leaders are debating. They must find a way, another way to reclaim their land. And from their discussions, a new response begins to take shape. These leaders reach an understanding. Resistance must now change. But what assurance do they have that this new form of resistance will succeed where the others had failed? The 1880s, Africa. By the dawn of the 1880s, European contact with Africa was not new. For centuries, European merchants had traded along African coastlines. Missionaries and explorers had traveled into the interior of Africa, while European diplomats and envoys had met African rulers, exchanged gifts, negotiated treaties, and sought access to African markets and resources. But for much of that time, Europe had dealt with African rulers as equals, sovereign powers, fully in charge of their territories. Europeans could trade, establish missions, and enter African kingdoms and territories, but only with the permission and blessing of African emperors, kings, chiefs, and clan leaders. African rulers were in control. They controlled trade routes, they imposed taxes, they commanded armies, and when they received European visitors, they did so on their own terms. But then, at the dawn of the 1880s, something began to shift. Europe was no longer satisfied with only access to Africa and having to operate through African leaders. Europe wanted more. It wanted control. It was the age of industrial revolution. Across Europe, industries were expanding, factories producing goods in greater quantities, creating a growing need for markets abroad. And with it came an insatiable demand for raw materials. European governments and commercial interests began searching for resources, markets, trade routes, and territories through which they could expand their economies. And in the 1880s, African land appeared to offer the answer. And it will not only be for trade, but for occupation as well. At that very time, European merchants started to demand protection for their businesses in Africa, and missionaries sought military protection for posts established in the interior of Africa. And so, European governments began searching for ways to undermine African sovereignty, seeking unrestricted access to mineral wealth, land for cash crop production, and African populations as a source of cheap labor. But there was a problem. All European powers wanted the same things at the same time: Africa and its resources. And they began moving all at once to capture and occupy African territories. This created a rush. As Britain moved into the interior, France feared being shut out. As France advanced, Britain feared its rival would seize the territories it wanted first. Portugal joined the race, seeking to secure its old claims. Germany entered the search for colonies as well. Belgium under King Leopold II pushed deeper into the interior of the Congo, while Italy, desperate not to be left out, joined the race through the Horn of Africa. Each advance provoked another, pushing the European powers into the African interior at the same time. Afraid their rivals would claim a given territory before they could. It was a race. The scramble for Africa had begun. And as the competition intensified, so did the danger of conflict between European powers themselves. They were all reaching for the same continent and its resources, for the same lands, and in some cases negotiating with the same African rulers. They needed rules. And so, between November 1884 and February 1885, representatives of European powers gathered in Berlin. It was a European affair. No African ruler was invited. The meeting sought to manage competition for African territories, establish principles for occupation, and prevent the race for Africa from leading Europe into war against itself. From Berlin came a framework through which the European powers could recognize each other's claims. The scramble had been legitimized with rules. Any European power claiming African territory now had to demonstrate control. It had to move inland, establish authority, occupy the territory, build administrative posts, and raise its flag. And suddenly, across Africa, European agents began appearing before African rulers with documents. There were treaties, agreements, promises of friendship, protection, trade, weapons, and military support. To African rulers, these treaties were not unusual. African kingdoms and communities had entered agreements with neighboring states, merchants, and foreign powers for generations through such treaties. A ruler could permit trade without surrendering his kingdom. He could accept friendship without giving away his sovereignty. He could seek military support without placing his people under foreign rule. And so, many African rulers negotiated and signed these agreements with European powers. But Europe understood those agreements very differently. What an African ruler understood as friendship, Europe declared a protectorate. What he understood as permission to trade, Europe claimed as exclusive control. What he understood as limited access to land, Europe presented as the surrender of the territory. Almost immediately, European governments announced protectorates and colonies over African lands. They empowered private European trading companies to govern territories, impose taxes, and raise armed forces. European officials and soldiers moved inland, establishing posts and raising European flags. The agreements offered on paper were becoming foreign rule on African land. And African rulers were only beginning to understand what had happened. Europe had come to take control. Africa was under active invasion by Europe. And across the continent, rulers, armies, and communities now had to decide how they would respond. Late 1880s. By the late 1880s, European powers were acting on the territorial claims they had made through treaties signed with African kings and chiefs. As per the rules established at Berlin, those treaties were being treated and presented in European capitals as evidence that African rulers had surrendered control of their territories. But this was not what African rulers believed they had agreed to. Across the continent, rulers protested. They called royal councils, questioned interpreters, dispatched messengers, and sent envoys to challenge the European demands. Some delayed giving clear answers where they gathered more information surrounding the treaties. Others attempted to use one European power against another, seeking relations with one power to reduce the pressure coming from another. African rulers insisted they had never surrendered their sovereignty. But Europe was not waiting. European officials and soldiers continued moving inland. Administrative posts appeared near African capitals and along major trade routes. European flags were raised over lands that African rulers still considered their own. Their arrival brought bold demands. African authorities were expected to surrender access to their lands and trade routes and relinquish political authority to European powers. The danger hidden inside the agreements was becoming clear. Protest, delay, and negotiation were not stopping the occupation. In Ethiopia, this realization came through the Treaty of Wuchale. Emperor Menelik II had entered the agreement with Italy, believing he was establishing relations between two sovereign states. But Italy used its own version of the treaty to announce that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate and surrendered control of its own foreign affairs. When Menelik II discovered this, he rejected the Italian claim and denounced the treaty altogether. And even as he protested, he began to prepare for open warfare to defend Ethiopia's sovereignty. Menelik II, like many other African rulers, had realized something, or were beginning to realize something. The treaty was only the beginning. Behind it stood the intention of full European occupation. And across the continent, the dispute over words was moving towards armed resistance. War. By the opening years of the 1890s, European forces were advancing inland in greater numbers. Forts were being built. Strategic towns were being occupied. African rulers were pressured to accept foreign officials, surrender control of trade, and recognize European authority, or lose their positions to rivals willing to cooperate with colonial rule. Under this pressure, some rulers began to succumb, but others refused. They refused even when their political positions and lives were under threat. Where refusal remained the answer, messengers were dispatched and royal councils met. Military commanders were summoned and warriors were gathered from distant regions. African armies answered the call, carrying whatever weapons they could obtain. Spears, swords, bows, shields, old muskets, and rifles. Cavalry prepared to cross open ground, while scouts and spies moved ahead to monitor European forces. It was a call to defend their sovereignty or be dominated by Europe. And in many African societies, the response was massive. Warriors traveled from distant regions to answer the summons. Some came with firearms, others with older weapons, but they came knowing their rulers, lands, and political independence were all under threat. The age of diplomatic refusal was giving way to open armed resistance. In the empire of Samori Touré, which stretched across parts of present-day Guinea, Mali, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, that resistance was especially determined. Samori had built a powerful state, organized an army, appointed commanders, established systems of supply, and acquired modern firearms through trade. He understood that France was expanding towards its territory. And when it did, Samori was ready. As French columns pushed inland, his forces attacked their positions, resisted their movements, and defended routes leading into his territory. Even with France's greater supply of men, weapons, and ammunition, Samori refused to surrender his sovereignty. And Samori was not alone. In Sudan, the Mahdist movement overwhelmed troops sent to suppress it, captured Khartoum in 1885, and established a state under its own authority. In southern Africa, the Ndebele kingdom fought the British South Africa Company. In Asante kingdom, resistance to British control continued and later erupted under Yaa Asantewaa in 1900. Across the continent, African kingdoms and societies were fighting back against colonial invasion. By the closing years of the 19th century, the contest had become full-scale war between invading European forces and African societies that refused to be subdued through treaties. But for most, the results were devastating. European powers possessed greater firepower, more ammunition, and a continuing supply of reinforcements. African forces standing against them in open battle suffered terrible losses. African fighters were beginning to realize that defeating European forces on the open battlefield would be extremely difficult. They had to change strategy. Guerrilla warfare was the answer. African fighters withdrew into forests, mountains, and difficult terrain where European formations could not easily move. They abandoned fixed positions, avoided open battle, and attacked from places they knew very well. African scouts and spies would watch European camps. When the moment was right, African fighters would ambush patrols, attack supplies columns, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. Samori Touré's resistance became one of the strongest examples of this method of warfare. As the French pressure increased, Samori moved his men and political center further east, refusing to remain where the French could easily surround and destroy his army. Settlements were abandoned where necessary. Supplies that could easily sustain the advancing enemy were removed or destroyed. His forces reorganized beyond each territory occupied by France. By the dawn of the 20th century, the battlefield across Africa had changed. African resistances were becoming more mobile, more difficult to locate, and less willing to fight on European terms in open battlefields. For a time, the surprise attacks cost European forces men, supplies, and momentum. European patrols could no longer assume that controlling a capital or raising a flag meant that resistance had ended. African fighters could strike at any time beyond occupied positions and vanish into a terrain colonial armies struggled to control. But then, Europe adapted. European commanders recognized that guerrilla fighters were being sustained by their own communities. Those communities provided food, water, shelter, information, and protection. And so, the Europeans moved to cut off that support. Colonial forces began attacking communities believed to be sustaining their resistances. Villages were burned, food stores were destroyed, cattle were seized, chiefs who refused to cooperate were imprisoned, removed, or replaced. Africans accused of carrying messages were publicly punished. Families sheltering resistance leaders were threatened. Communities were forced to choose between supporting African fighters and surviving colonial retaliation. During the Ndebele and Shona uprisings in South Africa of 1896 and 1897, British forces widened the war, attacking villages, seizing cattle, and destroying grain. As the supporting communities were weakened, the fighters became increasingly isolated. The very strategy that had allowed African fighters to survive outside the battlefields now exposed the people sustaining them to systematic retaliation. Guerrilla warfare had prolonged the struggle, but it had also drawn colonial violence directly into the communities that sustained it. And with their support system destroyed, many African fighters faced a terrible choice: continue resisting or abandon the struggle and submit. Colonial armies still possessed unmatched weaponry. African forces were losing fighters, supplies, and morale. Resistance after resistance was weakened and defeated. By the end of the 1890s, many rulers who had led the first two wars had been killed, captured, or exiled. Their armies had been broken, their captors had fallen, and European powers began establishing permanent colonial governments over African territories they had occupied. Taxes were imposed on African households. African men were ordered to work on roads, plantations, mines, railways, and military stations for the well-being of colonial governments. African lands were seized, movement of Africans was controlled, and communities were forced to grow crops demanded by colonial economies. Colonial rule was no longer only confronting armies, it was entering the day-to-day lives of Africans. And by the opening years of the 1900s, this became the new center of resistance. Resistance had taken on a different form. Across the continent, Africans began refusing to cooperate with colonial governments and administrations. African men would flee when labor recruiters approached. Families would hide their cattle and grain. Villagers abandoned settlements before tax collectors arrived. Some refused to carry supplies for colonial troops. Others attacked officials sent to enforce colonial demands. Resistance was no longer confined to royal courts and organized by armies. It was entering the ordinary life of Africans. In German East Africa, the pressure became especially severe. The German administration imposed taxes, forced labor, and a compulsory cultivation of cotton. Communities were required to grow crops for the colonial economy rather than for their own households. The burden was heavy. By 1905, anger had spread across the south of the colony. A spiritual leader named Ngwale emerged and helped inspire community resistance that became known as the Maji uprising. He distributed sacred water and convinced his followers that he would protect them against German bullets as he mobilized communities to confront German colonial forces. Out of desperation, communities divided by language, locality, and political tradition gathered under one cause. The uprising spread beyond a single ruler of army. Farmers, local leaders, spiritual followers, and entire communities entered the struggle born from shared burdens of colonial rule. It was another transformation. Resistance was becoming a mass community uprising. But colonial regimes responded with scorched earth policies, burning villages, destroying crops, and punishing entire populations that challenged colonial rule. Even mass community resistance was being met with methods designed to make continued struggle unbearable for Africans. By the close of the first decade of the 1900s, African rulers and communities had tried almost every method available to them. They had challenged European claims through diplomacy. They had sent envoys and letters. They had delayed demands and searched for alliances. They had fought from fortified towns and open battlefields. They had mobilized armies, cavalry, riflemen, scouts, and entire kingdoms. And when open battle became too destructive, they had changed tactics. They had withdrawn into difficult terrain, attacked supply lines, and fought through the support of their communities. And when colonial rule entered everyday life, resistance had entered everyday life with it. But still, one resistance after another had been crushed. One tactic after another had been crushed. Most resistance leaders had been subdued. Across Africa, rulers were being removed from the center of power. And colonial regimes had established permanent administrations with their officials and soldiers occupying strategic positions across the continent of Africa. By the opening years of the 1910s, African resistance was entering a new era. The great armed resistances had largely been subdued. Rulers had been removed from the center of power, their armies broken and their territories reorganized under colonial governments. For those still determined to resist, another method had to be found. It had to be found fast. But then, amidst that desperation, something remarkable began to happen. From within the colonial system itself, a new generation of Africans was emerging. Mission and colonial schools were producing growing numbers of young men and women who could read and write in European languages. Some were becoming teachers, clerks, clergy, journalists, interpreters, lawyers, and civil servants. Through their education and employment, they learned the colonial language, laws, and procedures of colonial systems. They could read official notices, study legislation, follow administrative decisions, and they began to understand how the colonial systems really operated. With that knowledge came an awakening. Africans could challenge colonial regimes through the very systems those regimes had created. This would require political organization. And unlike the earlier armed resistances, kings and chiefs would no longer have to occupy the leading positions. Educated Africans could organize, maintain permanent associations, and present political, social, and economic demands directly to colonial governments. And so, it was from this growing awakening that on January 8, 1912, in Bloemfontein, South Africa, African chiefs, clergy, lawyers, teachers, journalists, student representatives, and leaders of existing organizations would meet in that small church. When they had met and debated and expressed their frustration with the colonial order in South Africa, political organizing emerged as the answer. From that gathering came the South African Native National Congress, the first major national African political organization in South Africa. This would mark a new age of African resistance against colonial regimes. And from the 1910s onwards, this political mood began spreading across the entire continent of Africa. The old armed resistances had depended on moments of immediate crisis, when rulers summoned warriors to confront an approaching danger. These new political organizations would remain active from year to year, unlike the old armed resistances. Their members could meet, record grievances, monitor laws, communicate across communities, and maintain continuous political pressure. Unlike an army summoned only when danger approached, a permanent political organization could preserve its membership, return to unresolved demands, coordinate responses to new laws, and steadily widen its political influence. And from the 1910s into the early 1920s, similar organizations appeared elsewhere in Africa. Political leaders from the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia formed the National Congress of British West Africa in 1920. In Kenya, Harry Thuku and other organizers established the East African Association in 1921, campaigning against taxation, forced labor, land loss, and racial discrimination. In Egypt, the Wafd emerged in 1918 to challenge British control and demand the right to represent Egypt at the post-war peace negotiations. Resistance was becoming a permanent affair, not a single uprising, but an organized force capable of returning with demands year after year. These founders of these political organizations intended to confront colonialism through the very procedures Europe claimed to respect. They held congresses, drafted resolutions, collected grievances, submitted petitions, met governors, and even sent delegations all the way to European capitals. In South Africa, delegation traveled to Britain to protest the Natives Land Act of 1913, the dispossession of African land, discriminatory laws, and political exclusion. One delegation traveled in 1914, another went to Britain and the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, seeking intervention from the same imperial authorities who claimed to govern through law and justice. Representatives from British West Africa carried demands of political representation, constitutional reform, and greater access to education to London. In French-controlled territories, educated Africans and elected representatives used petitions, legislation, and legal arguments to challenge racial discrimination and demand greater political rights. The method was deliberate. European empires claimed to govern through laws and procedures, and Africans would use those very laws and procedures against them. However, there was a problem. The results remained very limited. Petitions were received, but responses were delayed. Delegations were heard and dismissed. Demands for representation were ignored. Colonial governments promised gradual reform while continuing to take land, impose taxes, exploit African labor, and deny Africans any meaningful political authority. Constitutional protest had created permanent organizations, but it had not forced colonial governments to surrender power. And so, resistance had to reach beyond meeting halls, governors, and imperial capitals. During the 1920s and 1930s, African-owned newspapers, pamphlets, journals, and political books expanded across the continent. They reported land seizures, unfair taxation, labor abuses, racial discrimination, and political exclusion. In Nigeria and other parts of British West Africa, African-owned media widened political debate and openly criticized colonial rule. In French-controlled territories, journals and essays debated citizenship, equality, assimilation, and African political rights. Print gave resistance a new reach. Africans who could not attend political meetings could still encounter the growing demand for change and learn how colonial policies affected communities beyond their own. Student associations also expanded. Through their meetings and publications, students exchanged ideas about colonialism, race, socialism, nationalism, and political freedom. These associations created political spaces beyond the established national organizations, connecting students with journalists, workers with clergy, and political thinkers from one part of the continent with other political thinkers from other parts. The audience was widening. But print had widened awareness without forcing colonial governments to surrender authority. Resistance would have to move beyond newspapers and other print media. So, again, resistance started to take on a new shape, leaving the debate halls and newspaper newsrooms. It became practical and entered the workplaces. Colonial governments depended heavily on African labor to operate railways, ports, mines, plantations, government offices, and transport systems. African workers began to realize that by withholding their labor, they could disrupt the economy upon which the colonial rule depended. This meant industrial strikes. Workers no longer had to confront colonial armies on the battlefield. They could actually attack the colonial system by stopping the work that sustained it. During the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, railway and tramway workers, government employees, and other laborers joined strikes against British control. In Sierra Leone, that very year, railway workers struck against poor wages and working conditions. And as work stoppages spread across Africa in the 1920s and 1930s, the strike became a new weapon of resistance against colonialism. With this, the struggle was beginning to move into the streets. Students, workers, women, traders, political supporters marched and assembled outside government offices, courts, prisons, and police stations to demand for reform. Across East, West, and Southern Africa, public demonstrations made colonial grievances visible in streets and towns where colonial officials could no longer contain them inside petitions and private meetings. In South Africa, African women in the Orange Free State organized against pass requirements in 1913, with further women-led anti-pass resistances expanding between 1918 and 1919. Political resistance had taken on a new face. It was no longer confined to educated elites. It was spreading through markets, schools, churches, mines, railway stations, offices, and city streets. Women used community and market networks. Workers used their labor. Students used their associations. Journalists used their newspapers. Clergy used their churches. Political leaders used permanent organizations. The struggle was widening. And as it widened, Africans increasingly recognized that the colonial problems facing one territory were connected to those facing another. One territory might be ruled by Britain, another by France, another by Belgium, another by Portugal. But the systems of foreign domination racial inequality, political exclusion, and economic control were very connected. Pan-Africanism gave that realization a wider political language and identity. African and diaspora leaders exchanged publications, organized conferences, and discussed colonial rule as a problem extending across African borders. The first Pan-African conference held in London in 1900 provided an early international forum and helped lay the groundwork for the first Pan-African Congress in Paris in 1919. These gatherings placed African and colonial questions before wider international audiences and allowed leaders from Africa and the diaspora to recognize common struggles across different imperial territories in Africa. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, student groups, newspapers, political organizations, and diaspora networks kept those discussions very much alive. Local resistance was becoming part of something larger, a continental and international struggle against colonial rule. And then, between 1939 and 1945, the Second World War happened. This changed the shape of political resistance against colonialism in Africa again. African soldiers were called to fight for European empires in a war presented as a defense of sovereignty and freedom, where their own countries remained under the grip of colonial rule. African workers sustained wartime economies, where their own communities endured greater production demands, taxation, and political control. By the end of the war in 1945, Europe's language of sovereignty and freedom had exposed a contradiction. If freedom was worth fighting for in Europe, why was it still being denied in Africa? After the end of the World War, after 1945, African political movements began expanding rapidly. The organizations, newspapers, student groups, churches, trade unions, political networks built during the previous decades began foundations for mass nationalist movements. A new generation of leaders emerged through those systems. Some had studied abroad, some had organized workers, others had edited newspapers or worked through political associations. They had inherited decades of experience. The structures of permanent organizations, the reach of newspapers, the discipline of trade unions, and the continental language developed through Pan-African networks. And the demands changed with them. They no longer demanded only better pay, improved working conditions, fairer taxation, and limited representation. They wanted change of regime. They wanted independence. Across West, East, North, Central, and Southern Africa, political parties grew into mass movements during the 1940s and 1950s. Workers, farmers, students, women, teachers, clergy, veterans, and urban communities entered the struggle. Resistance was no longer being carried principally by a small group presenting grievances to local colonial officials. Entire populations were becoming politically mobilized around the demand to govern themselves. Strikes became larger, demonstrations became more frequent, political campaigns reached further into rural communities. Colonial governments responded with arrests, censorship, imprisonment, emergency laws, and violence. But the movements only grew and continued to grow. By the end of the 1950s, colonial rule no longer faced isolated complaints from educated Africans. It faced entire populations demanding the right to govern themselves. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, European flags started to come down as colonial regimes yielded to demands across Africa. Territory after territory were being declared independent. The armies led by African kings and chiefs had been defeated, but they had laid the foundation for a resistance that continued until independence. Europe had conquered African territories, removed rulers, broken armies, and imposed colonial governments, but it had never eliminated African resistance. The resistance had only changed, moving from royal courts and battlefields into communities, schools, churches, newspapers, workplaces, political organizations, and then streets. And through every change, the objective had remained the same: the restoration of African sovereignty.